All right, we'll go ahead and start inshallah. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا ونبينا أبي القاسم المصطفى محمد وعلى آله الطيبين الطاهرين واللعنة الدائمة على أعدائهم أجمعين من الآن إلى قيام يوم الدين. Wherever you are, for the love of our beloved Prophet and his beloved progeny, please recite a loud salawat. Allahumma salli ala Muhammadin wa ali Muhammad wa ajjal farajahum. Almost a week, 6 days that we've had after Eid has been a good time to relax, inshallah, and really reap the benefits of this month of Ramadan that we went through. I know that, alhamdulillah, we had a lot of good programs that were going on in the month of Ramadan. A lot of these centers were doing their programs online. And so we had an opportunity to engage with scholars from different centers and different parts of essentially North America or even Europe as well. So alhamdulillah, that was another blessing that we were able to take away from this whole situation. And I know that inshallah, things, the economy and the society that we're living in is reopening slowly. But of course we need to be careful and we need to take our precautions as to how we would approach this idea of reopening. So inshallah, of course the CFK management will take a look at this issue and see what, to the best of their knowledge, what they can do with regards to reopening and how, whether right now is even the time to do that, and whenever the time does come, how to do that in a proper manner, inshallah. Having said that, we will continue with our Thursday night and our Friday night programs as we were doing before the month of Ramadan approached us. And for those who remember, we were discussing Thursday nights, we would go through the hadith session along with a little bit of the rulings, the ahkam that we have to cover. And also for Friday nights, we used to do the tafsir session, so we'll continue with that. Because we weren't able to finish the tafsir of Surah Yusuf, we will be continuing with that, inshallah, in the following weeks, including tomorrow night. So for those who are interested in the story of Yusuf alayhi salam, we will be continuing that tomorrow night. And inshallah, whoever would like to can join in for that. And of course, I believe this Saturday is also the day that we remember the essentially the graveyard of Baqi and the destruction of Baqi. So tomorrow night, I will be touching on that and speaking of that issue as well, just to remember our Imams, because it is important to always keep them in remembrance and always commemorate this day, even if it's, with a very short talk or a little touching on it. It's important for our children to understand. It's important for our children to know what has happened on this day and what this day stands for, and that we will never forget our Imams, and that our children know that essentially the graveyard of Baqi didn't always look like this. It used to be very different, and that certain ideologies, they came into the picture and started to change things. So tomorrow night, inshallah, we'll touch on that and talk about that a little bit as well, and really puts into perspective for our children the ghurba and the loneliness of our Imams, and how much they need to appreciate the fact that the message and the heritage and the literature of the Imams has come to them through the generations and through the centuries. And so I will talk about that more, inshallah, tomorrow night. Today or tonight, depending on how you look at it, we will be touching on the topic of calamities and difficulties and balas, what we would refer to as trials and tribulations, essentially, and what type of role they play. So I'll mention 3 or 4 different hadiths about this. These are very special hadiths that I've chosen for this topic because they really teach you and me a whole lot that we need to know about going through difficult situations. And I will say this ahead of time, this is my public disclaimer, that of course going through these hadiths, speaking of the standards that these hadiths will set for us, of course it's easier said than done. When we go through these hadiths, and at least as it relates to me myself as a speaker and as a person who lectures, I want you always to know that when we do mention these standards, it is not at all to say it is easy to obtain these standards. It is easy to reach or fulfill these standards. No, we mention these hadiths, we speak of these standards and these ideals so that inshallah we can move in that direction, right? Now, can you reach the point where you actually live by this standard? That's going to be very difficult, and I personally don't have such a claim. But the reason why we spend time to go through these and speak of them, and the reason why we speak so passionately of them, is that hopefully we can move in that direction and we can come close to it. Otherwise, like I said, these are easier said than done and very difficult to actually believe in these standards that the Imams are setting out for us. Okay, I want to start with this hadith because this hadith is really going to set the bar pretty high. It's really going to explain what it means to truly believe in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We mentioned this as we were going through the story of Yusuf alayhi salam, that the idea, or forgive me, the nights of Qadr, we were discussing this topic, the idea that Iman, faith, and disbelief, both of them, and even the concept of nifaq, which would fall somewhere in between the two of these, even though it's worse than kufr, right? Because the Quran says a munafiq will end up at the lowest level of hellfire. It shows it's even worse than a person who is kafir. But all three of these concepts, whether you're talking about faith, whether you're talking about kufr and disbelief, or you're talking about nifaq, during the nights of Qadr, specifically the first night of Qadr, we talked about this. We said that these concepts are not black and white. They are not such that either you have them or you don't have them. No, there are different layers to them. There are different levels to them. And therefore, there could be someone who might be at a lower level of faith and still have in that faith of his a little bit of kufr, a little bit of disbelief, a little bit of shirk mixed with his belief and with his faith. That's why the verses of the Quran say, وَمَا يُؤْمِنُ أَكْثَرُهُم بِاللَّهِ إِلَّا وَهُم مُشْرِكُونَ. Most people, they do not believe in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala unless that there is some shirk mixed in with their belief. Okay, having understood that, this hadith is of course going to show us and speak of a very high standard, and it's going to say only these people are truly believers in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. When the hadith says this, we have to remember that the hadith is talking about the highest level of faith. It's not saying that if you don't have this, that you are not amongst those who are faithful. It's saying the one who has the highest level of faith, right? This high standard, at the highest level, this is what this person is going to look like. What is this high standard? This is a hadith from the seventh Imam, salawatullahi wa salamu alayhi, an Abil Hasan Musa alayhi salam. He says, قال سمعته يقول, his companion Ammar ibn Marwan says that I was around the seventh Imam and I heard him say this: لن تكونوا مؤمنين حتى تعدوا البلاء نعمة. You guys will never truly be considered believers. Your faith is never truly complete until you reach a point where you see bala, you see trials and tribulations as a blessing from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The reason why I mention all those disclaimers is because that is a very high standard, right? If any one of us thinks that we can live that to that standard and fulfill that standard, we have to really think carefully because it's not an easy thing to really accept. What level of faith do you have to reach where essentially when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tests you, He puts trials and tribulations in your life, not that you would be dissatisfied with Him. That, of course, is a haram deed, and that is, of course, a sin. So we're setting that aside. Beyond that, you won't just be patient with Him. The hadith isn't even mentioning that. The hadith is taking this a step further. The hadith is saying beyond these two, you would reach a point where when the bala comes your way, you would realize that this is a ni'mah, this is a blessing. Not an easy thing to do. Okay. Then he continues, وَالرَّخَاءَ مُصِيبَةٌ, or musibatan, and that you guys would see ease as a musibah. You would see ease as something that is inconvenient for you. Okay. وَذَلِكَ أَنَّ الصَّبْرَ عَلَى الْبَلَاءِ أَفْضَلُ مِنَ الْغَفْلَةِ عِنْدَ الرَّخَاءِ. The reason why you would look at things from this perspective is because you would know that remembering Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in times of difficulty and due to the difficulty and due to the tribulation that you're going through is better for you than being oblivious of Him, of being unaware of Him when things are very convenient and easy for you. Because you would know this, then you would look at a bala, a trial and a tribulation, as something that is a ni'mah. Because you would say, whenever this bala and tribulation comes into my life, it forces me to think of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It forces me to raise my hands in dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And if not all of us are like that, most of us do fall within this category, and I speak of myself first and foremost, that unless bala comes our way, unless difficulty comes our way, a lot of times would we pray to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Of course, a lot of times we would not do that, right? If you look around in the world right now, and this really shows you how little we remember Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that for some of us, it takes a worldwide pandemic for us to then raise our hands in dua and ask Him for certain things. Why? Because when things are easy and convenient, He gives us those things and we don't even realize it. We don't even pay attention to it. And we will never ask Him for those things or thank Him for those things that He is giving to us unless He takes it away, and then we feel this need to ask and pray for those things, right? So essentially, the hadith is saying you will never have full faith until you reach a point where you see bala as a blessing. Okay. Now, to delve a little bit deeper into that, these next hadiths are going to explain why this bala is a ni'mah. How does a bala, how does a trial and a tribulation take you from the state of being oblivious of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala or towards Him and remind you of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? This next hadith is from the fifth Imam. He is narrating from the Prophet salawatullahi alayhi. He says this, لَوْلَا ثَلَاثٌ فِي ابْنِ آدَمَ. If it wasn't for three things as it relates to the son of Adam, if it wasn't for these three things in the life of the human being, مَا تَأْتَأَ رَأْسَهُ شَيْءٌ. There would be nothing that would get him to bend down. There would be nothing that would get him to prostrate. There would be nothing that would get him to set aside his arrogance, essentially, is what the hadith is saying. There's three things that really teach the human being a lesson. And that if these three things weren't in the life of the human being, there would be nothing else that would be able to teach the human being a lesson and break the arrogance of the human being. Okay, what are these three things? Number one, al-marad. The first is sickness and disease. And we've seen this all around us, of course, these days. That if it wasn't for this, the technological world that we have around us, the progression that we are making with technology, we would have assumed that we would have been untouchable. And of course, many of us have been assuming that, right? The society that we live in has been assuming that. That now the brain and the mind of the human being has reached a point where it's been able to figure out everything. Of course, we haven't been able to figure out everything. You look at the society that we live in, especially with what's been happening in these past couple of days, you find how essentially sometimes certain aspects of the society are still as barbaric as they would have been hundreds or thousands of years ago. Well, we see this in front of us. There's a lot that the human being does not know. And this is what makes Islam and the religion of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala so special. Because we think we know a lot about life. But then we actually go about things in our lifestyle, then we mess up. Then we find that we have all these shortcomings. That's where the religion of Islam really shines, because we need this guidance. Okay, he says the first thing that will break the arrogance of the human being is what? Is al-marad, sickness. And the second one, al-faqr, poverty. This is that thing that breaks the arrogance of the human being. Now, this is not to say that everyone who is going through poverty is an arrogant person. Of course, that's not what the hadith is saying. But as a general concept, the human being, sometimes Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will take away his wealth just so that he understands he's not in charge. Just so that he understands that he's not the one who's running the show. Second one is al-faqr. And the third one is al-maut. And the third one is death. If it wasn't for that. And this third one you can probably see in our life more than anything else. Right? Especially as people get older. The older you get a lot of times, the more you feel like you have authority over certain things in your life. Right? And the more this idea and this thought is solidified in your mind. Now, the hadith is saying, if this person didn't see the people around him dying, nothing else would break his arrogance. Now take a look at what the rest of the words of the Prophet say, because these next 4 or 5 words that the Prophet is going to say is going to be very special. He says this. He says, وَكُلُّهُمْ فِيهِ. In all three of these you will find in the life of the human being. But here's the thing, وَإِنَّهُ مَعَهُمْ لَوَثَّابٌ. But even though all three of these are there in the life of the human being, still, this human being is not going to act calm. This human being is still going to be arrogant. This human being is still trying to do whatever he wants to do. right? It's beautiful. The hadith said, if it wasn't for these three, we would not be able to maintain this human being. We would not be able to control this human being. And then the hadith continues, and it says, in fact, these three are there for the human being, and still it is difficult to maintain him. And still he acts like he can do whatever he wants to do. Wathaba means when you jump, right? When you have a sudden movement. And they use this word when you have an animal that you're trying to control. You have the reins of this animal in your hand. You're trying to control it, but you can't really do that, right? An animal that hasn't been domesticated yet, for example. You will see this with them. They're still, half beast, half domesticated animal. Because of that, they'll be having these sudden movements. They'll jump. They're still dangerous, right? The hadith says, it's only these things that can break the arrogance of the human being. And still, even with these three, we cannot domesticate the human being. We cannot control the human being. He still does whatever he pleases and whatever he wishes. This is one reason why the bala and the tribulation is a ni'mah, because it can control and maintain the human being. Recite a salawat, please. Allahumma salli ala Muhammadin wa ala Muhammad. Second hadith talks about this. The second reason a bala is a ni'mah or can potentially be a blessing is this, that in our literature we have this idea that sometimes when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala makes someone's life super convenient, super easy, and just showers him with blessing upon blessing while this person is sinning and not repenting. That's the key phrase in that sentence. While he is sinning and not repenting, right? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will shower him with blessings simply because there is a greater punishment that's going to come his way. And this concept in our hadith is referred to as the concept of istidraj. Istidraj refers to the idea, or comes from the root word of daraja. Daraja meaning the stair or a level of something. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala takes this person up level by level, and then the punishment is going to come his way. Now, this idea of istidraj will only happen when a bala and a difficulty does not come and present itself in the life of this individual. If the difficulty in bala comes, then this naturally and automatically means what? That this person, istidraj is not going to happen to him. God is not going to make his life easy to then punish him severely later on. Right now, as he is going and as he is making mistakes, the moment he makes a mistake, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala puts a small obstacle or punishment in front of him so that he wakes up. Right? So this is a ni'mah, this is a blessing from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Because the moment you have bala in the life of somebody, you know that this bala means that this person is automatically disqualified from having to deal with istidraj, from having to deal with that severe punishment that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is holding for later on. Now take a look at how the sixth Imam, he is going to explain this. He's going to explain how this plays out in someone's life. قال أبو عبد الله عليه السلام إذا أراد الله تعالى بعبد خيرا فأذنب ذنبا تبعه بالنقمة. Says when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants good for somebody, and he always wants good for somebody, but sometimes he will approach this goodness that he wants to give to somebody in a different way. And I'll explain that in just a couple of minutes. But the hadith says when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants good for somebody, whenever this person does something wrong, what does Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala do? تَبِعَهُ بِالنِّقْمَةٍ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will immediately put a difficulty in his life. وَيُذَكِّرُهُ الْإِسْتِغْفَارِ. And through this difficulty, he will remind him to perform istighfar, to repent to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. وَإِذَا أَرَادَ اللَّهُ تَعَالَى بِعَبْدٍ شَرًّا. And when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala doesn't want good for one of his servants. Okay, we'll have to talk about that. What does it mean that he doesn't want good? When does Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala not want good for someone? We always thought that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala always wants good for his servants. We'll have to talk about that a little bit. But let's just follow with the hadith for now. وَإِذَا أَرَادَ اللَّهُ تَعَالَى بِعَبْدٍ شَرًّا. When he doesn't want good for his servant, فَأَذْنَبَ ذَنْبًا. And the servant of his does something wrong. تَبِعَهُ بِالنِّعْمَةٍ. Think about this. He doesn't just not send a punishment. Hadith says that when he does something haram, God adds a blessing into his life. It's a very different approach, right? Not only does he not send him a punishment to wake him up, he in fact sends him a blessing. It makes his life supposedly more convenient. It makes his life easier even. Okay. وَيَتَمَادَى بِهِ. And because of this, this person, he just assumes as though life is going on and he has more time. He doesn't feel like he has to do tawbah right now. No, he feels like there's no one watching over him. He feels like no one is monitoring him. وَهُوَ قَوْلُ اللَّهِ سَنَسْتَدْرِجُهُم مِّنْ حَيْثُ لَا يَعْلَمُونَ. The Imam said, this is what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is referring to when He says that we will do istidraj with some people. Again, the key point in all of this is that this person, he has getting more blessings while sinning and not repenting from those sins in the process. If someone sins but they repent every time, that's not a problem if they're sincerely repenting, right? Then that's not a problem. This istidraj won't happen to them. But no, if someone does haram and they're oblivious, they don't care, they want to move on with their life, the first couple of times maybe Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will put a difficulty in there. Maybe the first 100 times, we don't know the number. But then there might come a point where this person is oblivious. Even when God puts these punishments in his life, still he will not pay attention to then do istighfar. Then after a while, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will start putting blessings in his life. He will make it more convenient. Now, why would Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala do this? And with this, I'll wrap up this portion and we'll move on to the ahkam. Why would Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala do this? How is this compatible with His mercy? That instead of sending this punishment in the life of this person so that he will wake up, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will bless him more so that he doesn't even have a chance to wake up. Well, first of all, this person, God already put punishments in his life, already put difficulties in his life, and he didn't wake up. So whether God does that at this point or doesn't, it doesn't really matter because he wasn't going to listen to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. First of all. Second of all, this is a threat from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And because it is a threat, it is more of a mental deterrent for this individual. Because when someone lives their life and then after a while they see that even though they're disobeying God, the blessings are still coming, and in fact they're coming more than they were before, then this is a mental deterrent that this person knows istidraj might be happening to me. And this severe punishment will act more of a deterrent than those small little difficulties that God used to put in his life that he was ignoring. This is how this is compatible with the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But to wrap up these three hadiths that we talked about, essentially one of the main reasons why bala and difficulty is a ni'mah, it's a blessing, is because the moment it happens in your life, you know that the severe punishment, you don't qualify for it anymore. Because as the hadith says, that applies to those who continue to disobey Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and their life becomes easier, not more difficult. Okay, so this is why the hadith says a bala can be a ni'mah. I will end with this hadith, it's very beautiful. This is also from the sixth Imam. He says this, قَالَ سَمِعْتُ أَبَا عَبْدِ اللَّهِ. One of the close companions of the sixth Imam, his name was Muhammad ibn Muslim, famous companion of the sixth Imam. He says, I heard the sixth Imam saying this, يقول الْمُؤْمِنُ لَا يَمْضِي عَلَيْهِ أَرْبَعُونَ لَيْلَةً. A mu'min will not go through 40 nights, 40 days and nights, إِلَّا عَرَضَ لَهُ أَمْرٌ يَحْزُنُهُ يُذَكِّرُ بِهِ. That there is no believer that will go through 40 days and nights unless that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, in this 40 days or nights, He will bring about some sort of trial or tribulation for him. He will bring about some sort of concern for him, some sort of matter that bothers him or annoys him. And through this difficulty, he will remember Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Because of this difficulty, he will remember Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? So when these trials and tribulations happen in our life, and as I mentioned earlier, this is easier said than done, this is, from certain perspectives, a blessing from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Moving on to the ahkam session, I think I have like 10-15 minutes, inshallah we'll cover that. Moving on to the ahkam session, or to the ahkam section, I should say, we were discussing the rulings of salat. And we said in salat, we discussed up until the point where we do qira'at, or we do Surah Al-Fatiha. I wanted to share this hadith about that because it has to do with salat, even though it's not the rulings per se, but it has to do with the philosophy of salat. It's interesting. And then afterwards, I'll discuss a little bit of the mustahabbat of qira'at. When we recite Surah Al-Fatiha or the next surah, what are the things that we have to keep in mind that are recommended when reciting these two surahs? But this hadith says this. It explains why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has taken parts of the Quran and has made it obligatory for us to recite certain parts of the Quran in our salat. Why is that the case? This hadith says this, and I believe this is from the 8th Imam. أنه قال أمر الناس بالقراءة في الصلاة لأن لا يكون القرآن مهجورا. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala essentially knew that if the Quran was not part of your daily salat, that it would be essentially forgotten. It would be forsaken. People would forget about it. People would isolate the Quran. Because of that, and in order to prevent that, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala did what? He took a surah of the Quran or 2 surahs of the Quran, and He made it obligatory in your prayer that you recite 2 surahs of the Quran at least. And this you will find across the different schools of thought that we have in Islam. Of course, within the Sunni school of thought, it is not wajib and it is not obligatory to recite a particular surah. No, you can recite a group of the verses of the Quran. It doesn't have to be a complete surah. Of course, in the Shia school of thought, we believe that both of these have to be surahs, Surah Al-Fatiha in a complete fashion and also another surah completely, right? Which is why I never start with Surah Al-Baqarah in the Jamaat prayer, because if I start with Surah Al-Baqarah, everyone knows that I'm going to have to go to the end, and by the time I'm done with the salat and I look back, I'm sure 90% of the brothers and sisters will be gone. So that's why we never do that. But the hadith is saying this is why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has made it wajib for us to recite Quran as part of our salat. Because He knew, and this is the wisdom of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because He knew that if He didn't do that, essentially the Quran would have been forsaken. People would have forgotten about the Quran. Okay. Moving on to the mustahabbat of qira'at. What are those things that we have to keep in mind when we are reciting Surah Al-Fatiha or the second surah that we will be reciting? Number 1. First of all, it is mustahab that before you recite the surah that you do ista'adah, that you say A'udhu Billah Minash Shaitanir Rajim. Why is this the case? Why is this mustahab? Of course, anytime that the human being wants to speak to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, first and foremost, what he needs to do is he needs to distance himself from shaitan. And that is symbolized through ista'adah. This is part of the philosophy of why we do ista'adah and why it's mustahab to do ista'adah at the beginning of salah. That's number 1. Number 2 is that, of course, in Dhuhr and Asr prayers, in the first and second rak'at, it is mustahab to say the Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim out loud. Now, why is this mustahab in particular? And I know that we have hadith about this. There's this famous hadith that speaks of this idea, that one of the signs of a mu'min is that when he is reciting his Dhuhr and Asr, that he will recite the Bismillah at the beginning of the Dhuhr and Asr out loud. Now, there is a historical discussion about this as well, that how those who oppose the Ahlul Bayt, they didn't used to do this, and because of that, the Ahlul Bayt have stressed and emphasized this. There's a historical discussion there as to how the history has played a role in this hadith. This is that same hadith that continues, and it says that another sign of the mu'min, for example, is that he would have a ring on his right hand. The other sign of a mu'min is that he would perform the ziyarat of arba'in. There's reasons why they have emphasized these particular attributes in particular and specifically. But this is also mustahab. Third thing that is mustahab that I want to mention is that when he is reciting the surah, that he will pause and stop at the end of each verse. So instead of going Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen, he would pause. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen, pause, ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, pause, and move on to the next verse. The fourth one is that as he is reciting the surah, that he will pay attention to the meaning of the surah. And of course, if we don't know the tafsir of these verses, then obviously we won't be able to do that. If we don't know at least a translation of them, we won't be able to do that. And the last one that I will mention is that in the third and fourth rak'ah, before he goes to ruku', it is mustahab for him to do istighfar. So after he has done Subhanallah walhamdulillah wa la ilaha illallah wallahu akbar 4 times or 3 times, then it is mustahab for him to say Astaghfirullah Rabbi wa atubu ilayh, and then he will essentially go to ruku'. While someone is in the form of qiyam and they are reciting this, these 2 surahs, it is also mustahab that they are looking at the muhr, that they are looking at the torba. And the reason for this is a sign of humility. That the human being will look at the turba, which naturally for the most part would be from dirt, and because he is looking at the dirt, he would be reminded of the fact of where he came from. He would be reminded of his origin, that he does not act arrogant in the presence of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He shows his humility in the presence of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and this is symbolized by him looking at the turba while he is reciting the surah. Okay. Moving on from that, I'll explain a little bit about tasbihatul arba'a as well, and then we'll move on. Tasbihatul arba'a, first of all, it is not wajib for it to be recited 3 times in the salat. It can be recited once. If someone is in a rush, they can do it once, that's not a problem. This is according to Ayatollah Khamenei and Ayatollah Sistani. Both of them have this ruling. And as it relates to the philosophy behind tasbihatul arba'a, essentially there are 4 phrases, and that's why we call it tasbihatul arba'a, right? The 4 tasbihat. These 4 phrases are there to symbolize the 4 sides of the throne of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They also coincide with the 4 sides of this house that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has in the heavens, known as Al-Baytul Ma'mur. Okay, what is this house for? It's not in this world. You don't see it in this world. It is in the other heavens. We don't have access to the higher heavens. But the hadith says that this is relates to the 4 sides of Baytul Ma'mur, and some say this is also the reason why the Kaaba has 4 sides. So when you recite tasbihatul arba'a, you are essentially, each one of them represents one side of the Kaaba. What happens in this Baytul Ma'mur, we don't know exactly. We have some hadiths about it, but we don't know. All we know is that hadith tells us that tasbihatul arba'a, it symbolizes the throne, it symbolizes the sides of the Kaaba, it also symbolizes the 4 sides of this house known as Al-Baytul Ma'mur. The Quran has referred to this, right? Wal Baytul Ma'mur, but it doesn't explain what this Baytul Ma'mur is for. It seems as though it's a place where the angels come and go in a higher heaven, a heaven that we do not necessarily have access to. But this is the philosophy, a little bit of a peek into why we mention these 4 tasbihat in particular. Having said that, before, and with this I will wrap up inshallah, before someone goes to ruku', there is a moment they are supposed to pause. And this is one of those lesser known rulings that we have when it comes to the ahkam of salat. In the ahkam of salat, we have 4 qiyams. We have 4 times where you have to be standing with a body that is calm. The first is at the time of takbiratul ihram. The second is when you are reciting the 2 surahs. The third and the fourth, one of them we know very well, the other one we don't know. The third and the fourth, one of them is obviously when you get up from ruku', right? You stand for a second and then you go to sajda. That is also wajib. But the fourth one that we don't necessarily pay attention to all the time is a qiyam that you are supposed to do before you go to ruku'. So when you're done with Suratul Ikhlas, for example, وَلَمْ يَكُنْ لَهُ كُفُوًا أَحَدٍ, you are to pause for a second. That's a qiyam. That's a standing position. For a second, you're supposed to pause, and then you go to ruku'. In fact, if someone does not do that, وَلَمْ يَكُنْ لَهُ كُفُوًا أَحَدٍ, and they're automatically moving while they're saying ahad, this prayer is batil. And in fact, this qiyam is a rukn, as opposed to some of the other qiyams that we mentioned. So even if you miss it by mistake, the salat needs to be essentially repeated. So this just shows you of how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants us to take our time when we are performing the salat. I will share this hadith with you. It's very beautiful. This is from the 6th Imam. He is quoting the Prophet salawatullahi alayhi. He says, بَيْنَ رَسُولُ اللَّهِ جَالِسٌ فِي الْمَسْجِدِ. One day the Prophet was sitting in the masjid. إِذْ دَخَلَ رَجُلٌ. When this guy entered into the masjid. And of course, if you come into the masjid, you enter because you're going to offer your prayers. فَقَامَ يُصَلِّي. So he stood up and he started to pray. فَلَمْ يُتِمَّ رُكُوعَهُ وَلَا سُجُودَهُ. But while he was praying, he did not fully perform his ruku' and his sujood. Meaning what? Meaning that when he went into ruku', before he was completely done with the dhikr, he would get up, right? Or when he would go to sujood, before he was fully done and he would pause for a moment, then he would get up. That's not what he was doing. While he was in the sujood, before his dhikr was even done, he was kind of already getting up, right? Which is what you will find sometimes. That's how, unfortunately, we will pray our salat, right? That it seems as though your sujood, metaphorically, is not really done yet and you're already getting up. Or your ruku is not really done and you're already getting up. Or your recitation of the surahs is not done and I'm already moving towards ruku. Okay, so essentially this person was rushing through his prayer. What did the Prophet say? فَقَالَ صَلَّى اللَّهُ عَلَيْهِ وَآلِهِ نَقَرَ كَالنَّقْرِ الْغُرَابِ. Very beautiful. The Prophet used this analogy. He said this type of prayer is like the pecking of a crow, right? When a crow goes around and starts to eat things, right, crumbs or seeds or whatever the case may be, the crow will peck at something, right? And when it's pecking at something, it makes this movement where it feels like, if you actually think about it, it's like someone who goes to ruku quickly, goes to sajda quickly and gets up. The Prophet said this person's prayer was like the movement of a crow. This is not how we pray. And then he said this, لَإِن مَاتَ هَذَا وَهَكَذَا صَلَاتُهُ لَيَمُوتُنَّ عَلَى غَيْرِ دِينِ لَيَمُوتَنَّ عَلَى غَيْرِ دِينِ. He said if this person were to leave this world and this is how he is praying, then he's not praying the way I taught him to pray. This is not the way we taught people to pray in Islam. That you would pray in such a way where it just looks like you are pecking the ground like a crow. That you are moving so fast back and forth that it seems as though you're making movements like the movement of a crow. This is the metaphor, the analogy that the Prophet is using. So what we understand from this is that between the different movements that we have in salat, we have to take our time. We have to pause and then we have to move. Specifically, when someone is finishing the two surahs, they have to pause for a moment and then go to ruku. If you don't do this, the salat is going to be batil. Having said that, inshallah, we'll bring tonight's that he can give us the tawfiq and the opportunity to act upon these teachings, inshallah. We'll have the dua kumil later on after salat, and tomorrow night, of course, we will have the tafsir session on the story of Prophet Yusuf and also the commemoration of the destruction of Baqi, inshallah. Let's take a moment to recite Surah Fatiha for all of our marhumin and marhumat with a loud salawat. Allahumma salli ala Muhammadin wa ala Muhammad. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. Ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Maliki yawmiddin. إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين